I will record this. So let's talk a little bit about the exam tomorrow. Okay, that's really the main thing that we're going to talk about this afternoon. So let's just kind of quickly review kind of what's on the exam, make sure that we know what to expect for the exam tomorrow. So the exam tomorrow, we're going to take in the morning. I'm going to give you till 11:30 to finish the exam. That should be more than enough time to finish the exam. I really don't think that time should be an issue for any of you, giving you that much time. So I'm going to put a limit on it because as soon as I say that you can take as much time as you want, somebody will take 4 hours, but I think realistically, that should be more than enough time to do this. This is going to be a closed book exam. So you are not allowed to look at notes. You're not allowed to get on your phone, use Google, whatever else. All right, so we're going to take the exam as we've taken the quizzes, where I want you to get on the Zoom, leave your camera running. I'll have my video off, but you should have your video on as a way to make sure that everybody's trying to be on the up and up in terms of, no outside resources other than those that you have stored away safely into your brain, okay? As I said this morning, I'm going to send these to you in a Microsoft Word doc. So I'm going to ask you to fill out your answers in the doc. If there are graphs, you can take pictures and then insert those pictures into the document, and I want you to send me back the document. So please do not send me back PDFs because, as I said, it's very difficult for me to comment on PDFs. So it's a lot easier for me to give you constructive feedback on Microsoft Word. So if you can send those back to me in the Word document that I send you, that would be best. Of course, I will be online. I will have my video off. I can't swear that I'm going to be at my computer every single second, but I will be there. So you can always chat me questions. If there's a question that you don't understand, or if you're having some sort of technical issue, you can always reach out to me and I will be around, if not immediately, within a few minutes, okay? Let's be clear about what is going to be covered on the exam tomorrow. So the main things we're going to talk about is Chapter 3 on supply and demand. It's a really bad D, right? Supply and demand. Chapter 2, not all of Chapter 2. The 5 pages in Chapter 2 that we covered on comparative advantage. Chapter 7 on GDP and inflation. Chapter 8 on unemployment. Unemployment and inflation. And then Chapter 10 on savings, investment, and financial systems. I consider everything that we talk about in class fair game. All right? So if we talk about it and it's not in the book, it's still fair game for the exam. Now, what about things that are in the book that we haven't really talked about or we spend very little time talking about? So I will be clear with you. I don't ask questions to test whether you have read the book, okay? So I am not going to look through the book and try to find something that we didn't talk about and ask you a question about that, okay? So I do not ask questions to test whether you've read the book. All of that said, reading the book can be a very, very useful way to spend your time, right? And so I very much encourage you to read the book. A lot of the stuff we talk about is technical, and if you can just listen to me talk about it and you understand it perfectly, great. But I think in my experience, most students need to have that backup of both listening to me talk about it, but also reading the chapter at once, if not twice, right? I think reading the chapter before class, coming to class, reading the chapter again after class is a very effective way to study. What kind of questions? There will be short answer questions. There will be definitions. You know I like to ask definitions. I've asked definitions on both of your quizzes. You will definitely be asked definitions tomorrow. Right? So there will be basically short answer questions, definitions, and short problems. Very much the mix that you've seen on your two quizzes. So I'm not, you know, on this exam, I am not trying to do anything different. I'm not trying to surprise you. I'm not trying to pull a fast one. Yeah, you know, I mean, I'm most interested that you understand the material that we've talked about, right? And so in that sense, I really don't think that there should be surprises, both either in terms of the types of questions or in terms of the kind of the material that I cover on the exam, right? It is not my intent to trick anybody. My intent is to test whether you've learned what you think that you've learned, and also to hopefully learn a little bit of something, right? It maybe ask you something in a little bit different way or ask you to extend your knowledge. But trying to trick you is not what I'm trying to do in these exams, all right? And so keep that in mind, right? Keep that in mind. I guess the last thing I would say about this exam is, you know, a couple of things about how to prepare. I really encourage you all tonight to engage in some active learning. And by that, I mean, don't just review your notes. But, I mean, of course, reviewing your notes is really important, but try to take some active learning strategies. By that, I could mean make flashcards, right? Make flashcards of key concepts or key definitions and try to do self-tests. Or try to copy notes or think about a question and try to rewrite that using your own memory, right? Try to take advantage of some active learning strategies. Or sit down and work some problems, right? And maybe you can work them by yourself and look in the answers which are posted on Moodle. Or maybe you want to sit down and work through some of the problems at the end of chapters with some classmates. But I very much encourage you to engage in some active learning techniques, right? Don't just spend the night flipping through your notes, because you know as well as I do what that usually leads to is you look at your notes and it's like, I know that, I know that, I know that. And then what happens when you actually have to express it or communicate those ideas in the exam tomorrow? Then you're like, oh man, I don't know that as well as I thought, all right? So definitely engage in some active learning, right? If you've been keeping up with the material, if you've been paying attention in class, you've been doing the readings, you shouldn't have to do that much kind of reviewing, all right? And so in that sense, a good way to study for the exam is to spend less time reviewing and more time kind of actively self-testing yourself and actively communicating what you've learned. And then I'll just say finally, in terms of test taking, there are always two strategies that work the best. Take your time to read the question, right? Take your time to read the question. As I said, time really should not be an issue for most of you. And so you don't have to rush through this. Take the time to read the question. Read the question a couple of times, all right? Make sure that you're just not jumping to some conclusion about what you think I'm asking you. And so I have noticed this in some of your quizzes that sometimes many of you have lost points unnecessarily because you just simply didn't read the question carefully, right? You didn't read the question carefully. You kind of skimmed over something. You didn't answer something that was asked in the question. So just take the time, right? Take the time. And then the other thing related to time is to think about organizing your thoughts, then start writing. And once again, this is something that I've observed from some of you in some of your quizzes, and I just think it's a typical problem for college students, particularly in this kind of class is, once again, you think you know what you want to talk about and you just start doing the stream of conscious thing, right? Instead of thinking about, well, what's really important here? What's really important here? Most of the answers that on this exam, you can answer very comfortably in 2 to 3 sentences, okay? So before you just start writing a lot, think about, what's the most important thing that you want to communicate here and focus on that, right? Think about what those 2 to 3 sentences should be as opposed to just kind of writing, right? So that is really the best advice I can give you all, right? In terms of either preparing to take the exam or taking the exam itself, right? But my goal for writing this exam, as I said, is not to trick you. If you've been putting the time in, if you've been working, reading the chapters, coming to class, being actively engaged in class, if you've been, kind of going back and reviewing notes and taking and conducting some of those active learning activities that I've been talking about, doing extra problems, then you should be prepared for this exam, right? And you shouldn't have to worry too much about something coming out of left field, because that's not the intent of this exam, okay? All right, well, with that all in mind, that's all I really want to say. So I want to open up the floor to you all to ask me questions about things that you might have in terms of the material or anything else. So ask away.
Questions are going to be on this test?
Can you repeat that? I didn't hear the beginning of your question.
Questions are going to be on this test, like roughly?
Yeah, I don't, probably like 12 to 15, but some of them will be long, some of them will be short, some of them have multiple parts. So, I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that the exam for most of you will probably take about 90 minutes. Some will be less than that, some may be a little bit more, but I'm writing the exam with about 90 minutes in mind.
What we went over this morning's not on the test tomorrow, correct?
What we went over this morning is not on exam number 1. It will be on exam number 2, but not on exam number 1.
I have a question on the end of chapter questions for chapter 8.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's on number 5. And it's mainly just part B on number 5.
Okay. So this is a question about a country's labor force is the sum of the number of employed and unemployed workers. So using the data here, calculate the number of workers employed, and then use your answers to calculate the change in the number of people employed. Okay, and then B, it says for each reason, calculate the growth rate of the labor force.
Yeah, and the part I was kind of confused on is that for Northeast, it has a negative growth in the labor force, which I was just trying to find the reason for why that would be negative. Because like from July 2015 to July 2016, it increases for each region.
Yeah. So remember what the labor force is, right? It's the number of people unemployed plus the number of people employed, okay? And then we talked about the labor force participation rate, which is the number of people in the labor force divided by the population. Okay, but remember the labor force is not the same as the population. So could you have the labor force decline? Sure. The labor force could decline because people could not be employed and not be unemployed, but essentially they could be not in the labor force. So you could definitely see the number of people in the labor force go down without a decline in the population, right? So that's definitely possible. And in fact, I think we showed you some data that that's actually one of the things that's happened during COVID, is that the unemployment has gone up, but the labor force has actually shrunk. And so part of this could be because of the discouraged worker effect, right? The discouraged worker effect is when people lose their job. What happens? At first, when they lose their job, they move from employed to unemployed. But then once you've been unemployed for a while, you actually will jump out, you'll give up, and you'll move from unemployed to not in the labor force, right? And that's the discouraged worker effect, right? That's the discouraged worker effect. And so, yeah, you definitely see that particularly during recessions and periods of time where there's high unemployment, you actually just get people that drop out of the labor force altogether, right? Because they can't find a job and they get discouraged. Does that answer your question, Gabe?
I mean, kinda. Like, to find the answer, I took like the labor force from July 2016 minus like the minus like July 2015.
Right. So if I can just copy this data down for everybody, I think if I'm copying this down right. So the labor force in 2015 was 28,397, and the labor force in 2016 was 28,565. So what's the percent change in the labor force? That's what this question is asking. So you want to take,
Actually,
isn't it part B?
I don't think it's a percent change because the answer is given in a graph that's not percentage wise. It's just numbers, numerical.
Well, it says here, calculate the growth in the labor force. So growth is a growth rate, in my opinion. So I think I don't know what the answer key has, but I think this should be a percent change, right? Because that's a growth rate. I mean, if they could calculate the change in the labor force, would be the difference between the two numbers. But if it says growth, that's a growth rate to me. So what you want to do is you want to take the 2016 value minus the 2015 value divided by the 2015 value and multiply by 100, right? So you want to take 28,565 minus 28,397 divided by 28,397 times 100. Did you do this, Gabe? Is this the way that you did it? And you should get.
The way I did it for B.
Mm-hmm.
So I just I just took 28,000. Like I did this like this is how it matched up with the answer key. So I took the July 2016 labor force and I just subtracted it by 28,397 since it says like calculate the growth. So like it went up by, then that's what I had for my answer.
To me, this is actually a very poorly worded question because when you say growth, you're really talking about a growth rate. It sounds like they actually, in the answer key, give you the change in the labor force. The change in the labor force is just this. But when they say growth, they're talking about a growth rate. And so I think the better answer, given the way that they've worded it, is this. And what you should find is that the growth is, oops, that's got to be negative, negative 0.9%. Right? Wait, did I have this wrong? No, I'm sorry. No, that's positive. Right, it's positive. Because 2016 is greater than 2015. So yeah, the growth rate was positive 0.9%.
Do you know why they would have a negative number as the answer to this?
Fuck up.
Yeah, because I was kind of confused of why it would just be like that in one region. Like it was.
Yeah, you know what? I honestly don't know. Now,
yeah, it might have just been a mistake.
In the South, there should be no. As I look at this, no, I don't know what happened. Screw ups. Screw up. There's a screw up in the answer key. So sorry about that. Okay, Sunny says, can we discuss questions from chapter 10 too, just to get concepts right? Sure. But I need a question. What questions do you have about chapter 10? I'm happy to talk about any chapter. Yeah, somebody.
Could we actually, sorry, but just since we're on number 5, could we actually go through D of that one?
Okay, D says, what can you infer about the fall in unemployment rates over this period? Was it caused by a net gain in the number of jobs or by a large fall in the number of people seeking jobs? Okay, so what's our unemployment rate? That's our unemployment rate. So if the unemployment rate goes down, there's only 2 reasons why the unemployment rate could go down. One is that the number of employed went down. Or the second could be the number of the employed went up, meaning that there were new jobs created and people immediately filled those jobs. So when I compare 2016 data to 2015 data, the one thing I know is that this happened. The number of unemployed went down. Now, this could also be partly responsible, but we actually don't have, well, actually, you know what? We could calculate this now that I look at it, because what is the number of people employed is the number of people in the labor force minus the number of people unemployed. So you could go through this for every region and figure out what's happening to the number of people employed. That doesn't feel like a particularly useful exercise to me, but I think what this question is really getting at is that you just recognize that there's really 2 reasons why the unemployment rate could go down. Because the number of unemployed goes down, or because the number of employed goes up. Meaning because there's new jobs created. We definitely know this one happened, right? You can see that from the data. We'd have to calculate this to figure out what happened to the number of employed every period.
But like, how would you, because the question asked, was it caused by a net gain in the number of jobs or by a large fall in the number of people seeking jobs? And we have all the data showing like how the unemployment rates fell and we know how many people are employed, but like, how are we supposed to know what the reason for that was?
Well, so you can calculate, as I said, you can calculate the number of unemployed people. So for instance, for the Northeast, I mean, this is the very intensive or more time intensive thing. I don't want to go through every step of it, but in the Northeast, you know, for instance, in 2016, the number of people unemployed was 1377, and the number of people in the labor force was 28,565. So you can use that difference then to figure out the number of people employed, right? Is the difference between those 2. Okay, so if you did that for every year, for every region, okay, you'll be able to look at the number of people who are employed. And then, of course, you can figure out what the number of people in the, well, once you know that what's happening to the number of people employed, then you can figure out, you know, common sense will tell you, is it caused by a net gain in jobs? If the number of people employed is going up, then it's obviously a net gain in jobs. If the number of people employed is going down, then you know it must be the alternative. So almost everything that has to do with the unemployment rate really requires you to, I guess, essentially know three equations, right? The first equation, you have to know what the labor force is. And then you have to know what the labor force participation rate is and what the unemployment rate is, right? From those three things, you can really tell everything you need to know about the unemployment, well, about the unemployment rate, right? Okay, other questions that people had?
Can you do a comparative advantage example?
Okay. So I'm going to do this very quickly because this is the kind of problem that we have worked through, I think, a number of times here. But okay, we have two people, Logan 1, Logan 2. And they can make two things. They can make pencils and erasers. Logan 1 can make 30 pencils or 20 erasers. Logan 2 can make 25 pencils or 15 erasers. And I'm sorry for insulting you, Logan 2, because you're less productive. Of course, I'm not going to tell which of you Logans, which of you are Logan 2. So you can both believe you're Logan 1, okay? So what do we need to do for comparative advantage? We need to figure out the opportunity cost. Right, for Logan 1, we have to figure out what the opportunity cost of a pencil and eraser is. And for Logan 2, opportunity cost of a pencil. Okay, one problem I noticed on your quiz, for those of you who messed up this problem or a similar problem like it on the quiz, is that you just simply didn't organize your thoughts very well, right? In other words, you kind of figured out the opportunity cost and then you didn't know what to compare to what. So you want to organize your thoughts here, right? You want to make sure that you kind of, notice here I put this like in a little bit of a grid, right? Where here now I can compare the two opportunity costs in pencils for Logan 1 and Logan 2, right? So I've set this up so that I know what I'm going to compare. And I think this is a mistake that many of you made, is you kind of figured out the opportunity cost and then you didn't know what to compare the what. So somebody help me out. What's the opportunity cost to Logan 1 of making a pencil? How many erasers does Logan have to give up for every pencil?
0.6. Yeah.
Well, not 0.6. 20 divided by 30 or 0.6
Oh, my bad. I did it.
pencil, right? And vice versa. What's the opportunity cost of an eraser? It's 30 divided by 20 or 1.5 pencils. Right, so 0.6 erasers and 1.5 pencils. I didn't do very good spacing out here on my screen. How about for Logan 2? What's his opportunity cost of a pencil?
.4.
It's 15 erasers for every 25 pencils, right? Or 3/5 of an eraser, or 0.6 of an eraser. And then what's the opportunity cost of erasers? Five-thirds of a pencil. Okay, who has comparative advantage in pencils? Who's the low opportunity cost producer of pencils? Logan 2, Zach says yes, because 0.6 is less than 0.66. 0.6 is less than 0.66. Logan 2 has comparative advantage in pencils. How about in erasers? Logan 1. Because 1.5 is less than 5/3. Can somebody have comparative advantage in everything that they do? Can you have a problem in which one person has comparative advantage in both things?
No, because that'd be absolute advantage.
Right, exactly. You can't, right? The fact of the matter is that being better at one thing makes you relatively more costly for you to do the other thing, right? And so no, you can't have comparative advantage in everything, right? You can't. The fact that you are particularly good at one thing makes it particularly costly for you to do the other thing. That's the whole point here. And so even somebody who's more productive at everything, like Logan 1, still benefits from trade by specializing in what he does best. In this case, making erasers is where Logan 1 has a particularly big advantage. And so you can extend that from Logan 1 and Logan 2 to the United States and Mexico, or the United States and China, right? I mean, the same principle, the same basic principle applies, that you want to specialize in what you do best. And people benefit from that, and countries can benefit from that as well.
So what would the equation be for this? You know how I normally ask for an equation, like at the end?
Well, in the past, I've asked, what's the price?
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Like, for instance, what's the price of a pencil? It's got to fall between these two opportunity costs. So it has to be greater than 0.6 erasers, but less than 0.66 erasers. It has to be between the two opportunity costs of pencils for it to be beneficial to both parties. Faith says, how would they set up fair trade for goods? I'm not 100% sure I understand your question, Faith, but I'm guessing you're saying, like, how would they trade these?
Yeah, I was mostly just asking the same thing, like, how would you get the equation? Like, what would go where? But we already got that answer.
Okay, yeah, okay, I see. Okay, who's got some other questions for us?
Can you go over how savings and investments are related with the equation in both a closed and open economy?
Yes. Both of them start with our expenditure equation, right? And here we have an open economy, because an open economy means open to international trade. And so we have exports and imports in here. And so what we did in class, it says that if you take this simple accounting idea, right? This is the expenditure equation of GDP that we talked about in chapter 7. If you take this simple idea, it tells you a lot about savings and investment, because if you move C and I and G over to this side, you can get this equation. What's total income minus private spending minus government spending? That's savings. And so this equation also implies that the difference between savings and investment must be made up by our trade deficit or trade surplus, depending on whether it's greater or less than 0. So in other words, our trade balance here reflects the difference between savings and investment in an open economy. So that has to be true in an open economy, that our trade balance reflects our savings and our investment. What about in a closed economy? Well, the same equation holds, but now X and M equal to 0. So in other words, then this equation becomes S minus I is equal to 0, or savings has to equal investment in a closed economy. So if you don't have any international trade, then savings has to equal investment. There's no other place for investment to come from other than your savings. If you have an open economy, there's another source of revenue, and that is borrowing from abroad. But the flip side of borrowing from abroad is running a trade deficit. So these simple accounting notions all come back to the expenditure equation, right, that we talked about in chapter 7. You know, they're essentially the logical, what follows logically from what we know about expenditure in that expenditure equation.
Wait, so sorry, in an open economy, the savings minus investment, that equals your spending, right? And your spending equals your net exports.
No, savings minus investment is equal to net exports. So if you spend more, you save less. And if you save less, there's only, according to this equation, there's only 2 things that are going to happen. You're going to have to invest less to keep this equation equal to each other, or that's going to have to go down. You're going to have to start running more of a trade deficit or less of a trade surplus. So if you spend more and save less, right, if S goes down, it means that either I has to go down too, or X minus M have to go down. It's just as I said, it's just simple accounting. And that accounting relationship follows right from our expenditure equation. Okay. Sunny says, building on this, can we please discuss questions 2, 4, 5 from chapter 10? I don't know that we can do all of those. Let me look through them. So let's quickly do question number 2. I don't think this is a particularly super interesting question, in part because I think it just, it largely asks you to just apply this equation, right? The question says, given the following information about the international economy of regalia, what is the level of investment spending in private savings? Right? Oh, you know what? This, I'm sorry for assigning this question. The problem here is that I actually did not, your book talks about the difference between private savings and public savings. And in my discussion, I did not make that distinction yet. We will talk about that later, but I didn't really make that distinction. So that's why this looks a little bit different. But let me do a version of this. Because total savings is actually part private savings and part government savings. So we didn't talk about budget deficits. And so that's why this question probably looked a little confusing to you, Sunny. And I'm sorry, I actually shouldn't have assigned this one to you. But let's just say, let's just use some of these numbers to make things, we'll make things as close as we can. Okay. Okay. So what must I be here? Well, this is really just kind of a plug or chug. Right? If Y is 1,000, C is 850, we're trying to figure out what I is. G is 100, X is 100, M is 100, negative 125. So what's I? 125. Right? No, I did that wrong. My math is wrong. Sorry. I is 75. What's our trade deficit here? The difference between X minus M is just negative 25. Does that help, Sunny? Question number 4 is really the same thing, except, as I said, it's a little confusing because I didn't make a distinction in class between public saving and private saving.
So are we gonna need to know how to do number 2 and 4 for the exam?
I didn't talk about a distinction between private saving and public saving, so I won't ask you to make that distinction on the exam. But you should know this equation. You should be able to do a problem like I just did here that we did talk about. Okay, who's got some other questions?
Will you kind of explain the Fisher effect a little more?
Yeah. hmm The Fisher effect is basically one of the implications of this equation that we talked about a couple of different times last week, that the nominal interest rate really has two different components. The real interest rate, and then what the market thinks expected inflation is going to be. So when the market sets your nominal interest rate, there's really two components to that. The first is they have to make some expectation about what the inflation rate is going to be. And then over that, they have to demand a real interest rate. And we call this interest rate the ex ante real interest rate. Ex ante meaning before the fact, meaning that there's risk here. Ex ante means there's risk. You're not guaranteed this interest rate. You're expecting this interest rate, but you're not guaranteed this interest rate. Okay? So the Fisher effect simply says, and it just follows from this equation. If expected inflation goes up by 1%, then nominal interest rates should increase by 1%. Right? So if expected inflation goes up by 1%, nominal interest rates should go up by 1%. In other words, if people think that the inflation rate's going to go up, then nominal interest rates should go up by that much. And so we looked at some data in class, and what did we see? Well, yeah, over the long run, this is true. But in the short run, not always. And that's because sometimes inflation is unexpected, meaning sometimes we get in changes in inflation that are not expected. And this equation says only expected inflation will change in interest rates. If it's unexpected, then nominal interest rates may not change. And so that kind of leads to some of the examples we talked about in class where, my parents locking into a mortgage. And then once they locked in for 20 years, there was unexpected inflation. That significantly changed the ex post real interest rate that they received. Right? The ex post interest rate, meaning the actual interest rate, turned out to be a lot different than the ex ante, or the anticipated interest rate that the bank expected to receive.
And does that work for any percent, or does it have to be just 1%?
Oh, any percent. I mean, just using 1% as an example. What we're saying here is there's a one-to-one relationship between them. 1-to-1. Okay. Next question. We're getting on a roll here. I can feel it.
Do you think we could do a problem that involves something like this?
That involves something like this. Okay, let's see if we can answer this question. What's the relationship between ex ante and the ex post real interest rate when inflation is unexpectedly high? Okay,
Wouldn't ex post be lower than the ex ante?
Okay, so let's think through it. Okay, let's think through it. So first off, let's make sure we understand the difference. The ex ante real interest rate is the difference between the nominal interest rate and your expected inflation. Right? To take that equation I just wrote up a minute ago and put it in a different way, ex ante real interest rate is the difference between nominal interest rate and expected inflation. And the key word there is expected. What's the ex post? It's the difference between the nominal interest rate and actual inflation, what actually happened. So let's say that you lock into a nominal interest rate. You get a mortgage that locks you into a nominal interest rate. What happens if inflation is unexpectedly high? If there's unexpected inflation, what does that mean? Actual inflation. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say exact.
Right. What that means is that actual inflation is greater than expected inflation. So what does that mean for this? If actual inflation is greater than expected inflation, then the ex post real interest rate has to be less than the ex ante real interest rate, because this is bigger than that. Who would win in this case? Who does this help?
People that are borrowing.
Right. Because they pay lower ex post. And who does it hurt? It hurts lenders. Right. Sonny. But I want to be clear here. There's a question mark, because whenever lenders get hurt, what do they stop doing? They stop lending, right? And so, right, that's not going to help borrowers in the long run. It's not going to help borrowers in the long run. At the risk of belaboring this point, let's go back and work through this same question, but let's flip it around. What's the relationship between ex ante and ex post when the real interest rate is unexpectedly low? What happens if inflation is lower than you expected? Now, actual inflation is less than expected inflation. And so, ex post is bigger than ex ante. So Zach says, well, that's good for lenders. And who it's bad for? Bad for borrowers, right? However, is this really good for lenders? Because what's the problem? If it's really bad for borrowers, then what do borrowers do? Sonny says they stop borrowing, but even worse, they just default, right? And so good for borrowers or good for lenders, not always. The problem here is default. And so what often happens when you have, right, people can't pay back their loans. So this is something that happened during the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, we're going to talk about this a little bit later in class, but there was an unexpectedly low inflation. Unexpectedly low inflation meant that borrowers had to pay very high real interest rates. And many of them just defaulted. And that contributed to a bank failure because banks simply cannot take a high percentage of their loans defaulting. And so when people started to default, banks were in real trouble. In Iowa, in 1932, 40% of farmers were in default. And so there was, what was the chance that an Iowa bank was going to survive? About 0%. Right? I mean, I think it's close to 50% of Iowa banks failed in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And so this is the case where, like, you know, high interest rates, yeah, sure, it could have been great for banks, but the problem is people didn't pay back their money. They just defaulted. And so once again, it's just an example of this that we've talked about a few times ago, that unexpected inflation or unexpected deflation is just not good for finance. Either way, borrowers and lenders can get hurt, and it's a way to really kill a financial system, right? It's unexpected inflation or unexpected deflation can really kill a financial system.
So pretty much that would just not be good for anybody.
In the end, it's not good for anybody. And so from an economic perspective, what's best? Steady inflation, right? Even more than low inflation, steady inflation is the most important thing. The more that inflation is predictable, the more that people will incorporate it into their interest rates, and, you know, you'll be fine. But it's unpredictable inflation, it's volatile inflation. That's what's the killer, right? That's what's the killer. So Faith says, so is ex post equal ex ante the best outcome? Well, yeah, in terms of long run growth, yes. Right? Because in that case, you're having very little uncertainty. And so, you know, in essence, the market is clearing and everybody who wants to get a loan can get a loan, right? It's essentially the most efficient outcome. It's the most efficient outcome. When ex post is not equal to ex ante, it's creating winners and losers, and that's not going to necessarily generate the most efficient outcome. So I don't want to get too much on the tangent here, but, you know, to take this at a different level, this is where many countries have gotten screwed up in the past. And to kind of connect this to something we talked about this morning, we're talking about economic growth this morning and good institutions. One of the institutions that we're going to talk about is good governments that create good institutions also are the kind of governments that create stable inflation, because that creates the proper incentives for people to save and invest. Oftentimes, bad governments have created very unstable inflation, and unstable inflation really creates bad incentives and is example of what we would call unproductive institutions. We'll talk a little bit more about this on Wednesday. I forgot to mention, this will maybe make you a little happy here as we get toward the end of our review session. We will not have class tomorrow afternoon. Okay, so I keep on talking about the next time we're going to talk is Wednesday. That's true. We won't have class tomorrow afternoon. You guys will be tired. I know from past experience that having class on the afternoon after an exam in the morning is usually not the most productive time. So yeah, no class tomorrow afternoon. You can kind of take that as a time to get caught up and rest and relax, and then we'll go full bore on Wednesday, okay? Faith says, are things like the consumer price index and aggregate price index going to be on the exam? Yep. Yep. Chapter 7. Okay, well, I'm kind of feeling like we're getting close to the end of our review session. So are there a couple of other questions that people really want to hear about, or feels like we've covered quite a pretty good range of topics. So I definitely do not want to cut anybody off if there's things that you want to still talk about. But on the flip side, we might be getting close to the point where you're ready to go ready on your own.
For taking pictures of the graphs, we can do that like through our phones and just like
You can do
email
that
it to.
through your phone. Yeah, that's
Okay.
fine. That's fine. Okay. Like I said, I'm going to be on I'll be checking the chat. I'm going to have my video off, but I'll be checking the chat. So if questions come up, if there's some sort of technical issue, I mean, every time I've given an exam, somebody's got a Wi-Fi horror story or whatever. Don't freak out, right? Nobody freak out. We'll get this. But do get on Zoom at 9 a.m. tomorrow, right? And then I'm going to start very promptly at 9 a.m. I'll send you all your exam, and you can get started. And like I said, 11:30 should be your finish time. But I really think that should be, 2.5 hours really should be enough time for all of us. I really don't see time being a real big issue. Of course, every time I say that, somebody sits and looks at one problem for 90 minutes. So don't do that. But, I think in general, 2.5 hours is a pretty generous amount of time for this exam. So, okay, anything else? All right, I'm going to happy to stick around if anybody has individual questions they want to ask. If you get panicked by something tonight, you can send me an email. I'll probably be checking my email probably up to 9 o'clock or something. So, you can, as best as I can answer it on email, I'll do that. But if not, I'll see you all in the morning at 9 a.m., okay? All right, good luck tonight.
I had a question about the problems you assign. We don't turn those in, do we?
No, these are just
Okay.
for your own work, and you don't have to do them all. If you want to do a few of them, I just kind of, instead of looking through all 20 questions, there's usually a question, well, which is the most, where's the biggest bang for your buck? And the ones I give you, I think, are usually the ones that I see are the most valuable. But no, you don't have to turn.
Okay.
They're not graded. No, nothing like that.
Okay, sounds good. That was my only question. Thank you.
All right, see you, Ryan.